Plasticity of human spatial cognition. Spatial language and cognition co-vary across cultures by Han and al. Questions about the plasticity of human cognition are central in cognitive science, specifically the issue of language differences and the consequences that these linguistic coding differences have on cognition. One perspective predicts little or no cognitive effects, another perspective predicts that language differences imply cognitive differences. Cross-cultural comparison suggests that the language one speaks indeed coincides with the frames of reference in which spatial memory and inference preferably operate, although these results remain controversial. Firstly, this paper aims to resolve the following conceptual and methodological issues in the spatial domain. What are the relevant frame of reference distinctions? Are the findings indicative of preference or competence of different frames of reference? How sensitive are the results to instructions that push either preference or competence? How sensitive are the results to task complexity? And how can we control for orthogonal differences? Secondly, 4 experiments were designed to address these issues. The experimental research question is, do cognitive strategy preferences differ across different levels of task complexity and instruction? Frames of reference are underlying linguistic descriptions of spatial arrays which specify the directional relationship between a reference to a shared spatial anchor. These include relative frame of reference, which specify directions and location from the individual's point of view using terms like front, back, left, and right. For example, the pig is to the front of the cow. Intrinsic frame of reference, which specify directions from the point of view of the object. For example, the pig is in front of the cow. An absolute frame of reference, a relation between a reference object and a landmark using cardinal directions north, south, east, and west. For example, the pig is east of the cow. This paper maps these linguistic frames of reference with 3 cognitive frames of reference. Relative is egocentric, intrinsic is object-centered, and absolute is geocentric. They predict that any difference in performance across spatial strategies would indicate not only a preference, but also a relative increment in competence. They predict over-instruction should induce a different response pattern. They predict that by increasing task complexity, the less speakers might be able to follow cultural norms. And to control for variation in formal education, this study focused on elementary school children. To avoid confounds of testing context in all experiments involving direct comparisons across populations, both populations were tested outdoors next to their school buildings. The present paper explores cross-cultural variation in spatial cognition by comparing spatial reconstruction tasks by Dutch and Nambian elementary school children. These 2 communities differ in the way they predominantly express spatial relations in language. Dutch speakers mainly use relative spatial relational descriptions, whereas the High-Ohm have dominant absolute system. 4 experiments investigate cognitive strategy preferences across different levels of task complexity and instruction. Experiment 1 uses a simple spatial array and unspecified instructions. 12 children from each of the communities were requested to do a task which involved memorizing a spatial array and then reconstructing it at a different location. In both cultures, 2 tables were placed on opposite sides of the school building, and a spatial array of toys was placed on table 1. Participants were always facing south during memorization and were then guided around the north side of the school to table 2 for reconstruction. Here, they were positioned facing west and rotated 90 degrees relative to their orientation at table 1. The participants and setup are identical in experiments 1 to 3. 11 Hayom participants gave at least 4 of 5 geocentric responses, while only 1 gave dominantly object-centered responses and none responded egocentrically even once. 1 Hayom participant responded geocentrically 3 times and object-centered twice. In contrast, all Dutch participants responded 4 or more times egocentrically. The children of the 2 cultures varied in their preferred cognitive strategy, with their preference matching the preferred mode of description in the language. This data shows cross-cultural diversity of cognitive preferences, as well as the close alignment of language and non-linguistic cognitive preferences. Additionally, The data shows that speakers of a predominantly absolute language prefer not only any non-egocentric over an egocentric spatial array, but also a geocentric over an object-centered one. Experiment 2. Experiment 2 was the free condition and was designed to investigate the effects of task difficulty to see if strategy preferences changed using a complex spatial array and unspecified instructions. Participants were shown one of 3 different complex arrays, which included 6 toys, without additional instructions. If the difference reported in experiment 1 is due to flexible processing of an overly simple task, populations should differ less in their solutions to a more difficult task. Reconstructing the complex array, performance was worse than in experiment 1. The populations once again differed significantly in the distribution of strategy choices. Dutch participants exclusively used an egocentric FOR to reconstruct the animals, while the High-Ohm population exclusively produced geocentric responses in the free condition. Experiment 2 used a more complex spatial array to increase task complexity and reduce possible effects of subvocal rehearsal. Despite the lower overall performance in comparison to experiment 1, cognitive preferences were unchanged. They did not detect any trend towards a shared underlying natural FOR in any direction, as might have been predicted as task complexity increases. They concluded that cross-cultural preferences are stable even in harder tasks. Experiment 3, the instructed condition, tests whether participants can easily adopt any strategy to remember a complex spatial array when given clearly specified instructions. In this experiment, participants were instructed to use the FOR they do not habitually use. They predicted that if cross-cultural differences are merely varying interpretations of unspecified instructions, a clear, unambiguous instruction to solve the task in the non-habitual FOR should easily reverse response patterns. To see if instructions had an effect, we compared distribution of choices between experiment 2, in which participants could freely choose strategy, and the instructed experiment 3 in both communities. Dutch and High-Ohm showed significantly different distribution of response types following the instructions. To test whether the instructions changed subjects' performance, we compared free and instructed trials within and across populations. Both populations performed significantly worse in the instructed condition than in the free condition. Moreover, High-Ohm children freely choosing to respond in a geocentric FOR outperformed Dutch children following geocentric instructions. Similarly, Dutch children freely choosing to respond in an egocentric FOR outperformed High-Ohm children following egocentric instructions. Despite the instructions, only around half of the subjects were able to change their habitual strategy, and only 1/5 of them successfully changed to the newly instructed strategy. Participants were not easily able to switch strategy on demand, and their attempts decreased their performance significantly. Despite understanding the instructions, children struggled to reproduce the array using a memory strategy which they did not habitually use, and which is only infrequently used in their language. Experiment 4 tested whether participants can easily adopt any strategy to remember a complex spatial array when given clearly specified instructions. High-Ohm participants were instructed to switch both to and away from their preferred cognitive strategy. Experiment 4 was conducted on a new sample of children in November 2008, 2 years after experiments 1 to 3. They predicted that High-Ohm children would show better performance for geocentric coding than for egocentric coding in a non-ambiguous instructed task. The task involved memorizing a spatial array and then reconstructing it at a different location. The results found the participants required less training to pass criterion after the geocentric construction in comparison to the egocentric instruction. On the simple trials, participants did perform significantly better than in the more complex trials, and participants performed better following the geocentric than the egocentric instructions. High-Ohm children show better performance for geocentric coding than for egocentric coding in a non-ambiguous instructed task. Their habitual absolute language preference and interpretation of spatial arrays coincides with greater expertise in geocentric coding. High-Ohm children struggled to reproduce the array using a strategy which they did not habitually use and which is only infrequently used in their language. In conclusion, this paper investigated cross-cultural differences in spatial cognition and their correlation with language differences. The data shows a correlation between the dominant linguistic strategy in the language and the preferred cognitive strategy used to process spatial relations, reporting a tight covariation between spatial language and cognition. The cross-linguistic differences were stable across an increase of complexity in the spatial array. They found no evidence for a common underlying natural tendency towards any single shared FOR across the two communities. Participants could not easily switch strategy on demand, and their attempts to do so decreased their performance significantly. They interpreted this data to be consistent with different stable behavioral preferences in the two cultures. The remaining difference in performance across spatial strategies indicates not only a preference, but also an increased competence to solve one kind of problem over another. This tells us that the human brain supports egocentric, object centric, and geocentric spatial cognition. Therefore, cross-cultural variability of cognition in the spatial domain is unlikely to be a matter of absolute capacity, but of preference and relative competence. The results show that, at least in some domains, cultural diversity goes hand in hand with cognitive diversity. Thank you.